Archaeology, the study of antiquity, takes us on a journey for a glimpse into a lifetime not our own. More than 3 centuries ago, we find a story hidden beneath crimson stone, born from the mud.
Plantation bricks weren't pre-made somewhere else and then shipped in. They were actually making them on the plantation.
A history stained with disregarded lives, forced into a volatile but also regimented environment.
Imagine the sickly sweet smell, the noise, the heat, the long hours.
Stories of a place flecked with hope.
I can just imagine a little girl clutching to a doll all day long.
Entrenched in cavalier elegance.
The house was on the grandest scale, very much like the English manor home that it was named after.
A story that takes science.
We use electrolysis to take all this gunk off and get to a clean piece of metal.
And technology.
It will hold the data, the analysis, maps, images of the artifacts.
To unlock a puzzle.
It takes some patience and some time.
Aged near a contemporary world swallowed by the earth.
The smallest things can tell a pretty big story once you learn how to look at them.
This is the Chatsworth Plantation and Sugar Mill, nestled in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Every plantation had its own sugar house. It was a status symbol. There were enormous amounts of wealth. It was the richest agricultural part of the United States before the Civil War because of the sugar cane.
Now you find another one of Louisiana's wealthiest institutions sidled up to the wealth of the past, entombed under piles of clay, silt, and grass.
After 100 years, all that happened at Chatsworth in the quarters area and in the sugar mill was that vegetation was allowed to grow. So the things that we found were pretty much in the place where they were left. And so that kind of undisturbed context was a real opportunity for us to understand how people lived over 100 years ago in the sugarcane plantation.
Luckily, we can rewind the clock and peek back on the historical record of the time period, where we find maps that lay out the picture of Chatsworth.
This map dating back to the 1770s, there was an Alabama Indian village located exactly where the plantation was, and there was a British fort, Fort Butte, located just north of Bayou Manchac, then called the Iberville River.
Then, in the early 1800s, Fergus du Plancher developed Chatsworth with his father, a Revolutionary War player.
Armand de Plantier was the aide-de-camp to General Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette, the French ally during the American Revolution, and he settled here in Baton Rouge, and his son started Chatsworth Plantation in 1830.
Du Plancher ran the mill using slave labor, but that changed when Francois Gardier took over after the Civil War. A little more than a decade later, following his death, the reins of the mill shifted to his son, Fergus Gardier.
This is a hand-colored map showing the layout of Chatsworth Plantation that he used in the planting of his crops.
No other state in the Union embraced sugar the way Louisiana did. Starting in the state's infancy, sugar soared in the early 1800s and continues its reign as Louisiana's single largest crop. But hundreds of sugar mills fell as the industry modernized. Chatsworth ended its run in the 1920s, and in 1930 the big house was demolished to make way for life-saving levees containing the Mississippi River, leaving Chatsworth untouched, abandoned, and overgrown for nearly a century.
It was amazing how much was there, and as we started going, we quickly figured out just what a massive site this is and how complex it is.
When we were excavating it, it just kept going on. No one was prepared for the size or the complexity of the area that came to be known as the sugar mill.
A tangled web of brick canals and iron pieces just waiting to come back to life.
At the very back of the plan, you had the sugar factory, which was quite busy and quite noisy and quite smelly.
You just have to imagine the kind of sickly sweet smell that would have been there, in addition to other chemicals and things being used, the noise, the heat, the the long hours, because during harvest season, the mill is running 24 hours a day.
14-hour shifts kept the slaves and eventually freemen who ran this mill in a constant battle with a burgeoning industrial beast.
Sugar gets sticky, so you have to clean your machines at least once a day, maybe even every couple of hours. There's also pipes transporting steam and water all across the mill to run all these different technologies.
It was that cutting-edge technology that allowed the large operation at Chatsworth to process sugar from smaller farms.
Ultimately, what we're interested in is how did this technology affect the people? Did it make their lives easier? Did it make it harder? Did it enable them to better provide for their family?
To do that, teams of archaeologists spent months slowly uncovering piece by piece, from the smallest bits of glass to iron sunken into the ground.
It's just massive. We have a ton of things that will never fit in a box.
A site where heavy machinery makes delicate but deliberate work next to the simplest of tools.
We would clear the features off with shovels and trowels. We would remove dirt and loose brick rubble out of the way.
The flow of water washes away decades of dirt, hiding the clues that help piece together the story of Chatsworth.
This was especially important because we had set up 2 levels of screen, 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch, and so we captured some very small detail things.
At this workstation, just a few hundred yards from L'Auberge Casino, archaeologists sort the minutiae freshly plucked from the ground, then ship bags of sediment, geological junk, peppered with artifacts to the lab at the Rural Life Museum. Here, a staff of professionals and students from LSU give the spoils of the excavation a quick scrub and sort the pieces into meaningful piles, then bagged, tagged with a specific geolocation, and boxed for storage.
Currently, our project is housed in close to 300 boxes.
It's in this lab where researchers discovered some of the more interesting finds of the excavation: this demon-headed pipe bowl, or a musket flask, likely filled with gunpowder a century ago, but sometimes the secrets aren't so easy to expose.
It's a wonderful event when something like this comes out of a clod of dirt. We had no idea what it was. We thought it was a pistol of some kind. It turned out to be a cat pistol. But it's amazing when these things are almost released from this corrosion and mud and dirt, and they become a thing again, an artifact again.
To make it an artifact again, archaeologists must borrow some tools better suited in a science lab. Using electrolysis, researchers are able to create a reaction that brings the forgotten scraps back to life.
This wheel's been in there about 3 days, and it's ready to come out. It was completely covered with mud and gross dirt, crud. And this, you can see it just flakes off now. All that corrosion and everything will just come right off with a little brushing. And you have a perfectly good valve wheel.
It's this clear grab to the past that makes the cache of corroded pieces so tantalizing to investigate.
This is an object. We know this is. We just don't know what's in there. But the important thing, the exciting thing, is to find out what's in there, to reveal how it was used and what part of the culture it served.
One of the most surprising finds among the artifacts set loose from the dust: evidence of Civil War activity.
We found well over a dozen Union uniform buttons, as well as mini balls and a cannonball and part of a Union bridle, which leads me to believe that there may have been a small Union post near Chatsworth Plantation.
The buttons most obvious in the dig were likely the remains lost from work contracted by soldiers who needed help cleaning heavy woolen coats.
They didn't have washing machines. It was a large kettle over a fire with women churning the clothes in soapy water for no telling how long. There wasn't a gentle cycle. It's not that surprising that buttons would have come off as they did, and we found them scattered around the quarters.
Another surprise: French and English flint.
The flint that we found was also totally unexpected.
The amber-colored stones were used primarily for flintlock pistols, old tech by the time of the Civil War, when percussion caps reigned.
percussion caps, they were a lot more reliable. So the flints for flintlock muskets just weren't useful for anything, and so they were made available. They were either given away or bought very cheaply because they no longer had a real use, and they were likely given to the people living in the quarters by the people that owned Chatsworth to use as a fire starter in the quarters.
The finds at Chatsworth date back further than the 19th century. Stones discovered link the site to the Alabama Indian tribe, who migrated to the area decades before sugar was king.
We know from the nature of these artifacts, from the way the pottery sherds are made to some of the stone that we have found there, that they came from Alabama, that these Indians would have brought either this bowl with them or at least one piece of stone with them when they settled on the banks of the Mississippi River in the 1770s.
The artifacts cataloged and counted begin to paint a clearer picture of the history of Chatsworth.
The puzzle for putting together the sugar mill was one thing, and the puzzle for putting together the quarters cabins, the double pen cabins we have back here, was another.
Researchers started with the quarters house, in this case the slave cabins, later shelters for paid laborers lining the road to the mill at even intervals of 100 feet. These examples at the LSU Rural Life Museum in Baton Rouge from another sugarcane plantation give a detailed look into what those homes were like. And at the center of each one, the hearth.
It's really important to kind of get into what is going on in these structures, and I think the hearth is really the perfect place to do that. These hearths are going to be the central location of activities in the home place. This is where people would have been cooking their food, where they would have been kind of just sitting around, possibly talking about their day, different activities that are going to go on in these structures.
The wooden home, warmed by the hearth and likely filled by families or working men, play host to hundreds of artifacts, often strewn into the fire.
One of these parallel hearths has an exceptional amount of artifacts in it, ceramics and glass. And it's also a structure where we found quite a bit of metallic artifacts, farm implements and things.
Into the fire or into the trash, it's where most of the artifacts were excavated.
Many of the things that people used, they either reused them or repurposed them, as we would say these days, for things, or they just dug trash pits and threw them in there, or they threw them into the privies.
And in the place where no one looks, these archaeologists found the nuances that make life at Chatsworth about more than sugar.
The history of plantations in the South have their own, some negative, some positive connotations. The history is what it is, but we had children, and we had children playing a variety of games. We have dolls, we have dominoes, jacks, marbles. So it really helps paint the picture about, yes, this was a working plantation, but people had their downtime, and kids were still very much a part of it.
The porcelain doll, its body long dissolved into the earth, but the face still there, as if looking for its original owner.
This was someone's personal toy, something probably held very dear to any child, as any child might have a favorite toy.
From toys to perfume bottles, buttons, coins, this treasure trove of artifacts all tells a story on its own. But together, that story becomes history.
You have the historic research, you have the artifacts which tell a very clear story, and you just have to have a way to put those two things together.
The team on the Chatsworth dig cracked the code, creating one of the most comprehensive databases in the Southeast region to catalog and make sense of millions of pieces of information.
It will hold not only the data, but it'll hold the analysis, it will hold maps, it will hold images of the artifacts associated with its catalog number. So it really holds the complete set of information that any researcher would need to know in this one database.
From the dirt to the screen, the more than 200 years of history of the site of the Chatsworth plantation, the people who worked and survived here, the things they did, and the sweet life they lived is all captured into the stroke of a keyboard, a gold mine of knowledge boiled down to the size of a sugar cube.
Archaeology just generates tons of data, and you have to be able to do something with that data. You have to be able to store it and be able to manipulate it.
Having that kind of information, that kind of scientific data, will be valuable for studying the future, because who knows what kind of scientific techniques will be available 150, 100 years from now, that this data can be reassessed, and people may learn even more from the sort of things we've recovered.
It's a story that began long ago and continues to evolve as curiosity is piqued and more minds dive into the data.
It's a never-ending process. All of our team members are pulling their weight and contributing to the story in their own way.
From the people blistered by the sun on the front lines of the excavation, the attentive workers painstakingly sorting the data bit by bit, to the people who help us understand how the pieces fit together.
It tells you a lot about the people who lived there. It tells you a lot about how they lived, and it gives us insight into our own culture and history of this area.
A history so sophisticated it speaks to modern day, the simple sweetness we take for granted today, and the flavorful history behind it, with its own culture and process.
You don't picture the Industrial Revolution and huge steam boilers and engines and just how advanced the technology was.
But now that story has new life, and it's tangible, more so than any other archaeological study in the area.
We know quite a bit more about how the Chatsworth plantation worked, and how the people who worked there and lived there, how they survived and what they did and when they did the things they did.
The story of a mill on a river where life stung and struggle was real, but it was always sweet.